Metamorphosis, trigger warning, eating disorder. No one had seen her for months. Just over a full year. It had been spring when she'd suffered, and then she'd gone away. Disappearing was easy. The global pandemic had forced everyone inside. When the world had come back out, she hadn't. She'd remained behind closed doors, living silently, quietly, like a shadow. She'd worked on herself, on her surroundings, on her body, her mind, her soul. She'd healed herself, her trauma, her wounds. She was a better person for it, but no one knew about it. Rosie had been fat, and bullied for it. She'd been the fat friend, the one out of breath as her friends walked quickly up the hill, the friend who loved her food. The friend who had the eating disorder that everyone laughed at, because she was too fat to be anorexic and she ate like a horse. None of them saw the monster in the mirror staring back at her every day. None of them felt the listless despair that came with eating every meal. None of them felt the panic, the struggle, that came with repeated attempts to lose the weight. Rosie had been spotty. Her skin had been bad, viciously bad, hormonal spots which she picked at because it was soothing. They'd bullied her for being spotty, too. None of them knew why she picked so ferociously at her skin. No one knew why she dug at spots and scabs for hours on end. No one understood the trauma that required her to hurt herself whenever anything good happened to her. Rosie had obsessive-compulsive disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder. Her friends didn't know how cutting their words could be. What they considered to be tough love, on any subject, served only as a trigger to Rosie's past trauma. Her friends didn't understand why she grew quiet whenever there was a minor disagreement, why she didn't speak up when she was being beaten down verbally. None of them understood that every word they said was like a knife into multiple old wounds. None of them cared for what those words and that treatment made her go through. None of them were there for that side of it. None of them cared that she would spend hours obsessing over what she could do differently to stop them hurting her. None of them gave a shit about the cuts in her skin to soothe the emotional pain. As the spring turned to summer, Rosie was thrust into her own company. The world shut down around her, and she had an excuse to hibernate, to cocoon herself away. Shops closed, work was from home, the gym closed. But Rosie didn't suffer like a lot of other people. Rosie did her work, and then she did her research. She found fitness coaches online, and they gave her the education she needed to tackle her first life issue. Weight loss. She grew stronger, her muscles more defined beneath her skin. She lost her layers of fat which had been a source of contempt for so long. Running was easy. She was lean, fast, strong. Jeans which she'd only dreamed of fitting into now fit snugly. She could button them up. They'd always told her that her choice of diet was wrong, was inconsistent, was bad, but this had worked. The fog of their descent had been removed, and suddenly everything fell into place, as the world started to die. And the ground grew crispy with the first frosts. Rosie began her work on her mind. Rosie found herself a therapist. Old thoughts died away, died off, fell to the ground. Old patterns of behavior which no longer serviced her crumbled away, sluiced away by icy cold waters of reality, soothed with warm and kind words from a therapist who seemed to be able to get right to the heart of her problems. Rosie felt like she was being pulled apart at the seams, ripped apart, broken down into every single component that made her. Snow began to fall, and Christmas time came. Rosie went home to her family. Her therapy sessions were over the phone, thanks to the need to socially distance. Surrounded by unconditional love, Rosie's skin healed. Scars formed where her wounds were deep, but no new ones appeared. Her face was clear, her body free from the wounds inflicted to distract herself from the emotional pain. She understood her pain now. She understood where it came from. Her father's absence and choice of another family had wounded her soul. And she needed to reconcile that and grieve for what she had lost. Christmas was taken from her by family unable to give. She and her mother and her siblings did what they could, but at the end, they were drained. Rosie didn't hurt herself because of it this time. Rosie went for a run, and she left her feelings on the tarmac. The new year didn't feel so much like a fresh start for Rosie. Ghosts of her past still haunted her. Every week, in therapy, she worked through the pieces of herself which her therapist had pulled apart. And she started sewing them back together. Better, leaner, stronger, more stable. As the first buds of spring appeared for the first time, Rosie still remained indoors. She focused on.
For Grandma Margaret, I have just gotten home from the longest of long 12 hours that somehow turned into 16 hours because of staffing issues, nursing shifts. I am exhausted mentally and physically, and I feel filthy with sweat, tears, and many other things I should not be covered in. All I want to do right now is chop something into oblivion until I feel somewhat normal again. I want to not have to think for just a little while. When I unlock my apartment door, I am surprised to find Grandma Margaret sitting at the kitchen table. Smiling, as always. After a shower and a change of clothes, I realizes that exactly what I need to do is make Knödel soup for myself and Grandma. What is Knödel soup, you may ask? It is a German dumpling soup that you'll be hard-pressed to find in any diner outside of the Midwest. Those who eat it are picky about how it is made, and no two people make it exactly the same. Not only that, but it is a recipe that is impossible to make exactly the same every time that you make it. Grandma Mary taught me how to make it as a small girl, long before junior high and shortly after I learned to read. It has always been our favorite meal to share. Starting with the vegetables, I carefully peels the potatoes, making sure that I cut off the skin, and only a small amount of potato. No conversation passes between the two of us. Grandma always knows when I needed a mental break at the end of the day and how most times I can't talk about what went so horribly wrong due to patient privacy. She never pushes me to talk about it. Instead, she sits at the table and watches as I goes through the motions of preparing our dish. A pound or so of potatoes later, I'm never too careful about the amounts that go into making Knödel soup, or the recipe. Knödel soup is not a dish of measurement, it is a dish of feelings. The amounts that go into it depend on what you're hungry for at the moment, what looks right, or what feels right. No recipe has ever been put on paper, just passed on from one generation to the next with wise words of, "Whenever it looks like enough, dear." Grandma always said that it was not a recipe meant to be shrunk or modified. It always makes a large amount, and any attempt at shrinking has been unsuccessful, although making it larger comes out perfectly every time. This works well when you are from the Midwest and are a firm believer in freezing the extra for a day when you don't want to make it from scratch. I chop the celery, carrots, and onions quickly as Margaret looks on from the table, nodding her approval occasionally. Once all of the vegetables are cooking in a lot of butter, yes, it's bad for you, but most comfort foods are, it's time to make the Knödel dough. My favorite part of making this meal, and also the most comforting. Eggs, flour, and a tiny bit of chicken broth get mixed together until everything is mixed together. The secret is to use only a certain amount of flour and add more chicken broth until it is right. Doing the reverse, adding set amounts of all three ingredients and adding more flour tends to make the dough taste just like you would think it would. Flour. Some people prefer chicken noodle soup, others like macaroni and cheese after long days. For me it is Knödel soup. Creating the dough is one of the most relaxing things I could think to do after a long day, and Grandma watches carefully as I knead the dough and rolls it into snakes. Only every once in a while does she gestures to add just a little more chicken broth. Dropping bits of dough into boiling chicken broth puts me into a trance. As I place the lid on the pot to boil for several minutes, my mind slips into the past. The bad melts away quickly, and memories of standing on a stool wearing Grandma's second-best apron make their way to the front of my mind. I remember the hem of the apron dragging on the floor at first, being so little I could barely see over the counter. Then I remember the awkward middle school years and unloading my boy and friend troubles over a bowl of Knödel dough. Lastly, I remember becoming an adult and trying hard to make time in my busy life for Grandma's house at least once a week. Though, once work, friends, significant others, and my own children came into the picture, it seems that almost 2 would go by before I found myself back in her kitchen again. As I put the finishing touches on the soup and turn off the burner, the memories fade and I am back in my own apartment once again. Grandma says nothing, but she has always made my day better, just by being there. I dish a single bowl of soup, butter a piece of bread, because nothing goes with Knödel soup the way a buttered piece of bread does, and sit down at the table. Grandma Mary has been gone for 11 years now, and on the hardest days, after the worst shifts, I always miss her the most. The regrets become an inner monologue, before being spoken out loud. Did I spend enough time with her?